Adrian Voss stepped off the shuttle and immediately regretted wearing the wrong shoes. They squeaked against the polished floor of the Interspecies Council's orbiting hall, a sound so alienly mundane that it drew several disapproving glares and one outright snort from a creature with 3 noses and 6 glowing eyes. He tried to imagine a smooth entrance, like he had rehearsed in the shuttle simulator, but the moment he shifted weight to avoid a hovering table, it floated upward and bumped a Luxarian delegate squarely in the chest. The Luxarian's robes shimmered indignantly, and Adrian mumbled something about zero-gravity etiquette, though he had no idea what etiquette existed here or anywhere beyond Sol. He scanned the room, and that was when he saw her. Elyara. Her form was almost human, curving with a familiar grace, but her ears were impossibly long, tapering to points that quivered in anticipation or mischief. He couldn't tell which. She was perched on a slightly levitating chair, one leg crossed over the other, and her eyes followed him as if he were a particularly amusing specimen in a galactic zoo. She tilted her head, and he felt the inexplicable need to apologize, though he hadn't yet done anything wrong. The room was full of life forms he couldn't name or even categorize properly. Crystalline bodies refracting the council's ambient lights into rainbows that danced across the walls, gelatinous beings that moved like water but with a mind to argue, and some with wings that hummed as though they were tiny generators of irritation. Adrian's first words caught in his throat. He wanted to introduce himself with something diplomatic, something that announced his presence without being humiliating. Instead, he said, hi. The word echoed in 7 different dialects and one tone that vibrated through the floor plates, causing him to stumble. A hovering datapad zoomed past his shoulder and he flailed, managing to knock a container of synthetic tea over. It splashed upward in a perfect arc, narrowly missing a delegate from the insected Hreltak species who responded with a sharp clicking shriek. Adrian froze. Elyara's long ears twitched, and for the first time he saw what he suspected was amusement flicker in her eyes. Humans, she said softly but loud enough for him to hear, graceful as ever. Her voice had a musical resonance like wind chimes in a gentle storm, and she flicked a finger toward the floating tea container. It obediently righted itself midair. Adrian swallowed and nodded, as if this was exactly how diplomacy worked. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he wondered if all alien societies were so simultaneously elegant and terrifying. He tried to compose himself as the opening speeches began. The Luxarians droned about trade harmonics, and the Zyrhins buzzed with impatience, their compound eyes darting to each other with what Adrian imagined were insults. Elyara's ears twitched in rhythm with the council's monotone proceedings, like she was silently counting the absurdities. When the Hreltak delegate hissed a threat about resource allocation, Adrian decided to inject a touch of humor. He made a small bow and said, "Well, I hope we're not negotiating lunch menus here or I might veto the soup." The room fell silent, some startled, some confused, but Elyara laughed, a sound like water over stones. Her ears flicked, and he thought he'd seen a real smile in a galaxy of masks. Adrian's next few steps were tentative. He moved closer to the central dais, tripping over a levitating floor panel that winked upward and then hovered obediently in place. Elyara's eyes followed him with a curious intensity, and he felt both judged and protected at the same time. He tried another joke aimed at himself this time. Humans, champions of awkward first impressions. A few delegates chuckled, or at least emitted vibrations that approximated laughter, and Adrian realized humor was not merely tolerated here. It might be a survival skill. The council's holographic screens flickered, showing a rotating galaxy of trade zones, disputed territories, and off-world colonies. Delegates argued with a sophistication and speed that made Adrian's head spin, and yet somehow Elyara's presence grounded him. She leaned slightly forward, her ears tracing subtle arcs that he began to understand as cues, a private language of gestures in a room where everything else seemed designed to overwhelm. As the discussions progressed, Adrian noticed a minor chaos that no one else seemed to acknowledge. A small robot, part of the council staff, had begun to mimic the gestures of delegates, producing a bizarre pantomime of diplomacy. Elyara's ears twitched again. "It's the little things," she whispered, her voice a melody he almost didn't catch. He smiled back, realizing that the council was not only a test of courage but also a place where absurdity could be weaponized. Adrian's attempt at intervention came during a heated debate over mineral rights in the outer colonies. The delegates spoke over one another in languages that sounded like a combination of wind and glass breaking. He raised a hand, cleared his throat, and said, "Maybe we could consider a slightly less destructive approach." Elyara's ears flicked twice and he took it as encouragement. The room paused. The Luxarian delegate raised a shimmering eyebrow. The Zyrhans emitted a soft hum that sounded like skepticism. Then, unexpectedly, Elyara floated slightly above her chair, demonstrating a tiny levitation trick that sent a ripple of surprise and amusement through the chamber. The tension eased just a fraction, and Adrian realized that courage could take many forms, even gravity-defying humor. By the time the session ended, Adrian was exhausted but exhilarated. He had survived introductions, minor disasters, and the full weight of interstellar judgment, all while keeping a tenuous thread of dignity. Elyara approached him as he gathered his notes, her long ears tracing patterns that seemed almost conspiratorial. "Not bad for a human," she said, her eyes sparkling. "You might even survive the next debate without causing an intergalactic incident." Adrian laughed, a genuine laugh, and felt the impossible relief of someone who understood the delicate mix of fear, respect, and ridiculousness that defined this hall. As he left the chamber, his mind buzzing with strategy, humor, and alien mathematics he didn't understand, he realized that Elyara's amusement had become his lifeline. Diplomacy here would not only test his courage, it would demand wit, timing, and the ability to keep his balance on a floor that refused to stay still. He straightened, adjusted his tie, and whispered to himself, "Humans. Awkward, audacious, and apparently indispensable." Somewhere, Elyara's ears twitched in agreement, and he thought he heard a soft chuckle reverberate across the floating hall. Adrian awoke in the orbiting guest quarters with a start, realizing that the synthetic tea spill from the previous day had left his uniform smelling faintly of something that might have been caramelized nitrogen. He frowned at the ceiling panels that rotated gently to simulate the rising sun of Seraphis, muttering something about humans never being designed for interstellar glamour. A small robotic attendant hovered nearby, chirping a polite greeting in 7 dialects, one of which sounded suspiciously like a sarcastic remark. Adrian raised a hand, accidentally knocking it backward into the wall where it bounced off with a soft boing. He sighed, rubbing his temples, and thought, well, at least gravity here is inconsistent enough to forgive clumsiness. The council chamber hummed with the quiet chaos of preparation when he arrived. Delegates floated in clusters, some with wings folded, some with holographic limbs flickering, all of them practicing what Adrian could only describe as a bizarre choreography of intimidation. Elyara was already there, perched on a hovering platform, her long ears tracing elegant arcs that suggested she was playing some silent game he didn't yet understand. She winked at him, or so he assumed, because her eyes seemed capable of multiple simultaneous expressions. "You're punctual," she said, her tone carrying amusement and the faintest edge of challenge. "Try to keep it that way. The council frowns upon humans with messy schedules." Adrian nodded, remembering that any delay could be catastrophic in a chamber where time seemed both measured and elastic. The first debate of the day concerned the allocation of energy cores harvested from the comet belts beyond the Auriga cluster. Humans had never interacted with these energy sources, yet Adrian was expected to argue the human perspective. He opened his mouth, intending a careful, reasoned argument, but his voice was interrupted by the sudden flutter of wings from a Biolume delegate who glowed in a spectrum Adrian couldn't name. The creature had sneezed, sending a cloud of luminescent pollen through the room, which triggered a cascade of sneezing from several crystalline species. Adrian coughed, blinking through the glittering haze, and Elyara leaned toward him with a grin. "Welcome to diplomacy," she whispered, "where allergies are tactical maneuvers." Gathering his composure, Adrian gestured at the holographic display, which projected a swirling model of the comet belts and their energy fields. He attempted a joke, "I promise humans won't accidentally vaporize a comet, at least not intentionally." A ripple of sound or vibration ran through the chamber. Some delegates hummed in amusement. A Fraltak clicked in a way Adrian interpreted as exasperation, though it could have been admiration. Elyara's ears twitched rhythmically and he realized she was signaling approval. Humor, he noted, could be weaponized. As the debate escalated, factions argued over the efficiency of energy transfer, the ethics of planetary interference, and whether a human representative should even be allowed near an energy matrix. Adrian found himself speaking extemporaneously, riffing on absurd human analogies, comparing energy cores to poorly behaved pets, suggesting that if a core grew teeth it should still be offered a fair trial. Some delegates rolled their eyes, or the closest thing they had to eyes, but Elyara laughed, her long ears flicking in amusement, and he felt an odd surge of confidence. She had given him a small, invisible shield of credibility in the room. Then disaster struck. A miscalculation in the projection system caused the comet holograms to spin wildly, colliding with a small cluster of delegates who were temporarily weightless. Papers and floating containers of unknown substances whirled in a gravity-less storm. Adrian lunged instinctively, knocking over the biolume sneeze cloud with a perfectly timed elbow. Elyara's ears twitched like twin pendulums as she murmured, "And this is why humans are dangerous and entertaining." Adrian, trying not to smile, muttered, "I call it intervention." The council took a brief pause, during which Adrian wandered toward the refreshments, a floating array of nutrient spheres that bobbed like tiny moons. He picked one up, only for it to hover out of reach, teasing him. Elyara hovered beside him effortlessly, plucking a sphere and handing it over with a wink. "Patience is a virtue here," she said. "Also dexterity, humans have neither in abundance." He laughed, nearly spilling the sphere into a low-gravity spill, and she gave him a subtle nod of approval. Humor, he realized, wasn't just a survival tool, it was the language of camaraderie in a hall full of species who otherwise spoke only suspicion. The afternoon debate turned toward trade rights on outer colonies. Adrian tried to introduce the human philosophy of compromise, punctuated with lighthearted metaphors about sharing bunk beds in cramped dormitories. The council members initially regarded him with the suspicion of predators sizing up prey. Elyara interjected at just the right moment, floating slightly higher than her chair to produce a dramatic effect, and whispered, "Sometimes absurdity saves the day." Her ears flicked, signaling to several other delegates in a series of gestures Adrian didn't fully comprehend, and suddenly the room erupted in what he interpreted as laughter, or the interstellar equivalent. By mid-session, Adrian began to understand that the council was as much about psychological dexterity as it was about logic. His jokes were not just tolerated, they were evaluated, tested, and occasionally weaponized. Elyara remained his unseen tutor, guiding him with subtle cues, her long ears tracing elegant patterns that seemed like a private code for human absurdity and tactical mischief. The Reltac delegate, who had been particularly hostile, clicked something that might have been respect or possibly a challenge. Adrian decided not to question it, assuming humor and audacity were his best weapons. As the day drew to a close, Adrian found himself in the center of the chamber, a human alone in a sea of alien sophistication, yet strangely confident. Elyara approached him, floating lightly, her ears flicking in patterns he now understood to be approval. "You've survived your first full debate," she said, "and managed not to vaporize anyone. Congratulations." He laughed, realizing that survival here required courage, wit, and a willingness to embrace chaos. In that moment, he felt something like triumph. The shuttle back to his quarters was quiet, and Adrian thought over the events of the day. The sneezing biolumes, the spinning comet holograms, the hovering nutrient spheres, and the countless subtle interactions that had tested his humor, courage, and adaptability. Elyara's laughter echoed in his mind, a reminder that even in the most alien of environments, human ingenuity and ridiculousness could carve a place. He settled in for the night, anticipating the next session, aware that the council was less a test of strength and more a theater of wit, audacity, and interstellar absurdity. Adrian Voss floated into the council chamber with a mixture of anticipation and a faint sense of dread, aware that today could define humanity's place among the stars. The hall was more crowded than ever, delegates clustering in low-gravity pockets, their holographic displays flickering with statistics, projections, and the occasional blinking warning. "Caution, human detected." Elyara was already there, perched lightly on a hovering dais, her long ears tracing subtle arcs in the air like conductors' batons. When their eyes met, she gave a slight tilt of the head, and he understood that this day's challenge was hers as much as it was his, though she wouldn't admit it aloud. The council had convened to vote on the Outer Colonies Treaty, a document that regulated trade, security, and resource allocation across dozens of star systems. Most species assumed that humans would either fold under pressure or commit some unthinkable diplomatic faux pas. Adrian, however, had spent the previous days learning not just protocol, but strategy, timing, and the most dangerous weapon of all in interstellar diplomacy. Well-placed humor, the Luxarian representative spoke first, voice shimmering like a solar flare. Adrian fought to hide a grin as he imagined the words coming out of a human news anchor's mouth. Our species values efficiency above all, even efficiency in being intimidating. Elyara leaned in and whispered, "Subtlety is overrated, go loud." Adrian swallowed and nodded. Subtlety had its place, but sometimes, a well-timed human audacity worked better than protocol. Adrian began by addressing the delegates in a voice that carried across the hall, even as holographic projections twisted reality around him. "Esteemed members of the council," he said, "I come not as a conqueror nor as a mere observer, but as a human who has spent far too long negotiating over parking spaces on Earth. We are persistent, surprisingly resilient, and sometimes absurdly clever, and while our methods may appear chaotic, they are remarkably effective." A ripple of laughter or its alien equivalent moved through the room. Elyara's long ears flicked and he felt a rare thrill of approval. The debate that followed was relentless. The Hreltek argued that humans were reckless, likely to misallocate energy cores, and probably a biological hazard. Adrian countered with a series of analogies comparing interstellar trade to interspecies sports tournaments, peppered with absurd jokes about the difficulties of refereeing a game with six-legged participants. Elyara added a subtle signal with her ears, directing attention to sympathetic delegates who had been quietly watching him all along. The chamber seemed to shift in his favor, the walls vibrating with anticipation, tension, and a strange, low-frequency amusement. At one point, a minor holographic glitch caused the Outer Colonies map to spin like a carnival ride. Delegates stumbled in zero gravity and one biolume sneezed, releasing a cloud of luminescent spores. Adrian seized the moment, juggling a floating datapad and a nutrient sphere like a circus performer. "Fear not," he called, "the humans are in control, probably." Elyara's laughter, a musical cascade, filled the chamber, and suddenly the room's tension lightened. Even the most stoic delegates blinked at him with something that might have been respect or at least curiosity. The pivotal moment came when the vote was called. Holographic ballots flickered in the air, one for each species. Adrian's pulse raced, but he realized he had grown since his first day. He was no longer just a nervous human trying to survive alien scrutiny. He was a negotiator, a performer, a subtle manipulator of perception and expectation. Elyara's subtle signals guided him, but now he understood enough to read the room himself. He added a final quip. "Let's vote for cooperation unless someone here prefers chaos. Personally, I find chaos exhausting." The chamber rippled with laughter and low hums, the delegates' previous hostility tempered by amusement and a grudging admiration. The holographic tally spun and blinked, then solidified. The treaty passed with a narrow majority. Humans had been given full rights to the Outer Colonies, and Adrian felt a wave of relief and triumph. Delegates approached, some cautiously, others with a humorously awkward reverence, congratulating him in languages that bent his tongue in new directions. Elyara floated to his side, her long ears flicking in a gesture that seemed almost celebratory. "You've done well," she said, voice light yet carrying gravity. "Humans might not always understand diplomacy, but you've certainly mastered charm." Adrian laughed, realizing the truth in her words. Charm, humor, and courage had carried him through a chamber full of beings more powerful, ancient, and complex than he could have imagined. He had learned to trust intuition as much as logic, timing as much as strength, and absurdity as much as reason. Diplomacy, he realized, was not just about rules or rhetoric. It was about connecting across differences, finding the ridiculous, and using it as a bridge. As the council adjourned, Adrian and Elyara lingered, watching the delegates float away, some engaged in heated post-vote commentary, others chasing errant holographic displays that refuse to obey gravity. She leaned closer and said, "Next time we might try interstellar chess. Humans tend to be unpredictable in more ways than one." Adrian smiled, thinking that